Hey viewers, my name's Cara. I'm your host for Tuesdays here on the Pagan Perspective, and this week we're doing a topic from Angelo, and it is about resources that have informed our paths that would be considered unlikely resources. Things that aren't what we think of as being geared toward pagans and witches. They're not specifically pagan resources. So this might be things like college classes or books that aren't geared toward paganism specifically. This was a little bit hard for me to come up with a list, and you'll see some of the things on this list I'm still not sure whether or not they really count as unlikely resources, because I think of them as being intrinsic to my path as a pagan and as a witch. But if I really think about it, are they necessarily pagan or witchy things? So, let me just dive into it. Firstly, so I have notes here, so I remember everything and hopefully don't ramble too much. So the first thing on my list says everything, ... I feel that everything informs my practice. Everything in the world can become part of my worldview or teach me something. So that is an important thing about my path, and that's probably part of the reason why this was so difficult for me to do. So the first thing was everything. Oh, cool. Good start. The next thing I have on my list is like areas of science and general study about the world that a lot of people actually think are contradictory to paganism and witchcraft, because we talk about magic and people think that magic and science are like opposites and can't get along, and I think that's completely false, because a lot of us, especially, the easiest examples that I can come up with are for those of us especially who are nature-based pagans, who are nature-reverent pagans. So things like the science of knowing why the seasons happen, and knowing about axial tilt, and knowing about the way that the planets revolve and orbit around our solar system, and the way that the moon looks illuminated throughout the cycle, all of these things, knowing why the seasons are opposites on opposite sides of the wheel, if you will, in the northern versus the southern hemisphere, knowing all of these things, right? And taking it even a step further, knowing about plants, knowing about animals, like knowing about the things that live on the earth and how they work, knowing about the water cycle, knowing about, all of these things, right? These are things we learn in science. Geology, knowing about rocks and knowing about crystals and how, so if you're a person who's into crystals, crystals are a part of your practice. People think of crystals as being really new agey things. Okay, crystals are really old. Rocks are really old. And there's nothing really new about them. Of course, the new age referring to the mindset of like the age of Aquarius, this new zodiac astrological age that we're coming into. But anyway, so if you're really into crystals, for example, the science behind knowing how crystals form and why they form and why certain types of crystals are water soluble, and so you probably shouldn't cleanse them in water or leave them in water for a long period of time. Knowing that science can keep your crystals safe and your collection from deteriorating. Knowing why amethyst is purple and why amethyst is different from citrine, is different from smoky quartz, is different from rose quartz, is different from clear quartz, when they are all the same type of crystal. Why are they different colors? The science of knowing those things and why those things inform the meanings that we give to these crystals in metaphysics and in our magic. There's science behind all of those things. And so those studies, geology, biology, archaeology, all of these things, right, inform the way that we work with the things that we may work with in our practice. One that I wrote down specifically also that I've been getting more into, I used to be very into when I was younger, and now I'm getting back more into, is astronomy. because I've been doing a lot more with astrology and with moon magic, and I'm preparing some courses to offer online about working with the moon and magic with the moon. And in my Facebook group, Moon Magic, which you can find through my CuteWitch772 Facebook page, we talk a lot about astronomy, and we're coming at it from an astronomical point of view rather than an astrological point of view, talking about, like, okay, why does the moon do what it does, and why does it appear the way that it does, and what is it called when it does this, and why are these things significant, and why did people years ago think such and such was significant? And so how we learn things about the planets, and I do this with Saturn too, with my Saturn Returns course and magic with Saturn in our lives, knowing about Saturn and how its rings were formed and how many moons it has and all these things. We can take the scientific fact that people have figured out and use that to inform how we work our magic about those things. Because the more that we know about the thing that we're interacting with, the more closely we can interact with it and work with it. The next thing on my list is, it's a whole realm of things that I think are very much related to paganism and witchcraft that I realize more and more not everyone thinks they are, and perhaps they're not. So the first thing on the list is energy work. That's a thing that a lot of pagans and witches do, but is it necessarily pagan? No, absolutely not, because there are definitely non-pagans and non-witches who do energy work. But even more so, I've been seeing more from people who, are becoming experts in improving yourself through energy healing and energy cleansing and all these practices that don't identify as pagans, they don't identify as witches. A lot of people in their audiences do not identify as any of those things. And so it's really bringing these practices to an even wider audience. And so perhaps those things are things that pagans and witches use. And they were never intrinsically part of magic, right? And there's a lot of science to them as well, of course. The way that energy works, the way that energy flows through our bodies, all kinds of things. But there's been a lot of things like that. And for example, I just finished recently, within the past month or so, I just finished reading The Warrior Goddess Way by Heather Ashamara. It's the sequel to her first book, Warrior Goddess Training, that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about and seen ads pop up throughout the past couple years. It's got the word goddess in the title, but when you read the book, at least I haven't read the first book yet, but in the second book, she mentions the goddess a few times, but it's definitely not written as a pagan or witchy or even goddess worshiper book, right? It's more of a self-help book than anything, but it's talking about the goddess. It uses this phrase, warrior goddess, and it's women's spirituality. It's the divine feminine. And so it's been really interesting for me to read a lot of these things that are really built toward a wider audience of divine feminine and women's spirituality folks, a lot more of the people who don't identify as pagans and witches, and to realize that a lot of that work is exactly the work that I do as a witch and that my fellow witches are doing in the circles and in the communities that I've been a part of. Like, this is the self-transformational and world-changing work that we do as witches, and here's a bunch of non-witches doing the same thing. And for me, it's like, that's magic. Like, they're doing magic and they don't realize that that's what they're doing, which is totally cool, because I think it's awesome that that is being embraced by more and more people. But, me being an educator about paganism as far as tolerance and understanding and reducing the prejudice and stigma, I also worry about, how many of those people might still harbor negative associations about pagans and witches because they think we're doing something totally different, when here we're actually doing the exact same thing and they're doing the things that we do. And I'm hoping that that can also be a bridge to help people understand more of what a lot of us do. And I'm not going to pretend that every witch does things the way I do. I know that. There are witches out there who do completely different things, and they're not doing any of the self-transformational or world-changing work that I and my fellow witches are doing. But it is work that a lot of witches are doing, and it is work that a lot of non-witches are doing. And so I think it's just very interesting. So I see those things as being very related to my path, but they may or may not count as unlikely resources if you are someone who's non-pagan and you come across these things, right? So similarly, the next thing on my list is Christian spiritual books. A few years ago, I came across a book called Dance of the Dissident Daughter by Sue Monk Kidd at a library, and it's written by a Christian woman, and it's about her journey discovering the divine feminine, and it's called Dance of the Dissident Daughter. I really love it. I wrote a poem about just some of the things that I took away from that book that really touched me, that have really informed my path, and I don't talk about them specifically as being like, ooh yeah, this new big part of my path, I got it from this book, right? But just a lot of the same energy, a lot of the same ideas, and it's just so cool to hear other people's journeys coming to a new form of their spirituality, opening up to a feminine aspect of the divine if you're coming from a tradition that was very heavily patriarchal. Similarly, I have this one here called Guidance from the Darkness, The Transforming Power of the Divine Feminine in Difficult Times. I have not read this yet. I found it at a bookstore, but I picked it up because, hello, the title. But it's by the Reverend Mary Murray Shelton. And so this is another thing that is by a Christian-based woman, female author, about the transforming power of the divine feminine. So it might seem like an unlikely resource to some people because they're Christian. They're not pagan. It's not a witch writing this, or at least it's not a self-identified witch writing this. But yeah, I have another one actually somewhat similar called Woman Spirit Awakening in Nature by Nancy Barrett Chickerneo, PhD, Growing into the Fullness of Who You Are. I don't remember what religion, if any religion, this author identifies with, but this is a book about women's spirituality and self-help in also specifically connecting with nature. So it's listed as book categories go. It's listed as spirituality, self-help, women's interest. So not all of these books, and I've even seen at some libraries, I've seen books about altars and setting up altars for like focal points. I've seen those kinds of books listed under interior design at the library, and they're not even listed as spirituality or let alone paganism or whatever specific religions might be mentioned in there. So there's a lot of things that they're not billed as like, oh, this book is for pagans and this book is for witches, but it's stuff that's directly related to our paths, depending on what your path is. But, you know, a lot of things for me. Oh, the next thing. I have, literally, there's a book downstairs in my living room that I am borrowing from someone because they lent it to me because they thought I would enjoy it. I haven't had time to read it yet. But it is about the Christian practice of praying with the elements. The classical elements, earth, air, fire, water. It's a Christian book about Christians praying with the elements and how that works and why they do it. And I haven't had time to read it yet, but I'm really excited to do so because I just think that's so cool to realize that, like, there have always been areas of Christianity that have held on to those very nature-based ways, but yeah, it's really cool to find books and be like, hey, this is a thing that seems like Kara would be interested in because of the work that she does and the stuff that she talks about. So yeah. And the next thing is fiction books. So a lot of these are books, right? A lot of these are books. I read a lot. The next category on my list is fiction books that are, you know, they're not necessarily pagan, witchy. Some of them are that I'm going to talk about, but that are related. So, like, I always talk about Marion Zimmer Bradley, that's historical fiction, like The Priestess of Avalon and The Mists of Avalon. It's historical fiction, but it absolutely informs my path as a pagan because it's historical fiction about pagans, right, basically. And Marion Zimmer Bradley's co-author, Diana Paxson, I believe identifies as a pagan. I know that she speaks at pagan conventions and such. So the first thing on my list, though, other than those, which I love, is the Fairyland series by Catherine M. Valente. It's actually under the juvenile fiction section in some of the libraries that I've seen, not even young adult. Like, it's for little kids is meant to be the audience. But I found out about the novels through S.J. Tucker, who is a pagan singer-songwriter, musician from Arkansas, who you should look up if you don't already know her. I have videos. I hung out with her at Conway Pagan Pride in Arkansas a few years ago. I have a playlist on my channel. My personal channel is CuteWitch772. The link is in the description of all these videos. Anyway, she writes music inspired by other things, such as books. So she has a whole album called, is it Wonders? Or Wonders, is about, inspired by, the Fairyland series by Catherine Valente. And I have never, probably in my life, even when I was a child, I don't think I've ever been more connected and tapped into the Fae realm than during the period of time a couple years ago when I was reading one after the other of the Fairyland novels. Because it just, when you're reading them, you're so much more immersed, and then throughout your everyday life, you're just paying more attention to the realm of fairy. And I can't even begin to describe to you the things. But just all these connections kept happening, and like, characters from the book would show up in my life, not literally like, hey, I'm a character from the book, but, you know, like, their names and things about them would just pop up into my awareness that, you know, they've always been there, but it's things that you've never paid attention to and noticed before. So I definitely recommend them. Another one here that's on my shelf that I read I finished it in February, is Summerlong by Peter S. Beagle, who is the author of The Last Unicorn. You might be more familiar with this title. This is his most recent novel, and it is, again, not directly pagan, but definitely has to do with the pagan worldview. I won't say any more than that, in case you want to read it and care about spoilers. But yeah, and also, I mean, while I'm at it, the Book of Speculation by Erica Swyler, it has to do with tarot, so there was that aspect of it for me, and some of the things that were said about tarot and the way that the characters read their cards and have a relationship with their cards informs me as a tarot reader. And then the other ones I have here, I just finished reading the second one like a week ago, The Brixen Witch, and the sequel, One Witch at a Time, by Stacy DeKaiser. Now these are, in the world of the stories, there are witches. The books aren't necessarily about witches, but there exist witches within the world of this story. And I love these. I've been posting about them on Instagram. I've been posting on Instagram every time I finish a book. I forgot to post when I finished Summerlong, though, so I need to add that on there. But I'm talking about these and how cute they are, and how much, like, they're very much fairy tale related to witches, and the way that, you know, the stories that the characters tell, the way that they interact with magic and what they think about magic, the way that the witches in the story are, just, I like a lot about it. And there are some things that, you know, like a snippet, a sentence here and there, something that some character said, or, you know, a nursery rhyme that the children in the town are singing. I'm just like, ooh, I'm taking that. That informs my worldview about witches. And so I liked it. And I have more books here that I haven't read yet that were given to me because they have to do with witches or magic and all kinds of things. And that's by no means all of the fiction-related books that I have that are magic-ish, but you might consider those likely resources more than unlikely, but I thought I would mention them. Also, Neil Gaiman. I'm sitting next to the box, the empty box, because the deck is downstairs, for my Vertigo Tarot, which is a tarot deck inspired by the characters of Vertigo Comics from the DC universe. And this deck was created by Neil Gaiman, Dave McKeon, and Rachel Pollack. And, you know, if Vertigo Comics characters can inform a tarot deck, then a Vertigo Comics-based tarot deck can inform the path of a tarot reader. I love this deck, and I use it I use it exclusively for my year card readings right now, which I'll put a link in the description to that as well on my blog. But that, the Sandman graphic novels series, friggin' everything about it. The way that the archetypal characters of the Endless are presented, the way that they exist through time and through dimensions, and just everything about it is so cool, and part of my, really, informs my path, for sure. The Graveyard Book graphic novels as well, I took a picture of some specific, like, moments of conversation, quotes that different characters said that I'm like, ooh, that, like, that is a thing that resonates with me. So, for sure. And then the last thing, I didn't mention when I was talking about the Christian spiritual books. For a while, a couple years ago, I attended a Unitarian Universalist church. And while Unitarianism and Universalism were originally two Christian denominations that were not heavily agreed with, because theirs are the viewpoints that did not win at the Council of Nicaea, when the Council of Nicaea decided that the Trinitarian view of the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, or Holy Spirit, or whatever you want to call the third one, that the Trinity was a thing. There were those who didn't agree with that, so they still existed, and, excuse the horn honking, and they were Christian denominations, but throughout their history, they realized that they had a lot in common, and so they came together to form Unitarian Universalism, which now is not considered a Christian denomination. It's a new thing that was born out of two Christian denominations. But based on, there are 7 principles that Unitarian Universalism is based on, and as long as you agree with those 7 principles, which are things like, we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, we believe in the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, we believe in the interconnected web of all existence, of which we are all a part, things like that. As long as you agree with the 7 principles, that's all it takes to be a Unitarian Universalist. And beyond that, you can be Christian, Buddhist, atheist, agnostic, a witch, a pagan, whatever. I've met so many different people at UU churches. There is always at least one pagan at every UU church that I go to. And actually later this year, I've been asked to come and speak at another UU church again, because someone saw my workshop on Pagans and Prejudice at, I need a drink of water, at Cleveland Area Pagan Pride last year, and so they invited me to come down to their UU congregation in Southern Ohio and talk about whatever I want to talk about, not necessarily the prejudice stuff, but whatever. Which brings me to the last thing on my list is my psychology class in undergraduate school, where I learned about the psychology of prejudice. And so, you've heard me talk about this a lot. I took a class called Stereotyping and Prejudice, and my research, I was allowed to do all of the research about the way prejudice works and stereotypes and whatever. We all had to pick a group of people to relate that stuff to. So I did mine about prejudice against pagans. And I have transformed that into a workshop, into a lecture that I do at Pagan Pride events, that I have done the lecture portion of it for a private coven group up here in northeastern Ohio. I'm going down to this other congregation in southern Ohio to talk about whatever, not necessarily just the exact thing that I present as Pagans and Prejudice, my workshop, but I'm sure I'll be talking about that as well. I have recently been given the opportunity to participate in like an online panel, I want to say, I guess it is, about just educating people and educating how we can educate ourselves in a world that is so full of misinformation, which is a big thing, obviously. So, yeah, the number one thing, and why I wanted to save it for last, is like the most unlikely thing a psychology course that I took in college is like one of the biggest things that informs what I do with my path. I use the stuff that I learned in that course every day of my life, and every pagan event I go to, and every time I do one of these videos about, well, like, how do we deal with people who don't agree with us, and how do we deal with people who think we're evil, and how do we deal with people who think that we're immoral, and basically how do we go about our lives and interact with people who are completely misinformed about our views. Like, how do we do that? I'm pulling from my personal experience, but also a major thing is the study of psychology and of how stereotypes work and why we stereotype and why prejudice persists. And, knowing those things can inform how we work toward reducing that from happening over and over, and how we deal with it when it happens, right? So yeah, that was my number one. It's kind of a countdown. Awesome topic, Angelo. Thank you so much for suggesting it. If any of you have suggestions for topics, there is a link. I'll put links below, and I think on the channel main page now there's a community tab. There's a post that says comment below with suggestions, so you can comment below that post with topic suggestions, as it says. You can also send a private message to this channel, Pagan Perspective, and stuff like that. So I'll put that in the description. We're going to need new topics for the year. I have a few months, or a couple months from now, are already set, but we're going to need more all year. So bring them in. Let us know what you want us to talk about. We will start revisiting some topics that we haven't talked about since maybe year 1, year 2, year 3 of the collab. We're in like, what, the 9th year? Going on 10 years or something like that. So we'll be revisiting some of the things that we haven't done in a long time that maybe you guys haven't asked us to revisit yet, but I think is time that we do, or can be cool if we do. So yeah, look forward to that. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening to all of my words, and I will see you next week. Until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye. Feel free to leave some of your own unlikely resources that have helped you in your path in the comments.